Hi everybody, my name is Michael Demeng and welcome to Strange Tales of Myth and Magic. In this podcast, we're going to explore mythology and magic and fairy tales and wives' tales and maybe some snakes' tales. We'll take a peek at some of the strange legends and stories throughout history and how they affected culture and how they affected me as an artist. So sit back and let me tell you a story. This week's episode, Nosferatu. A Symphony of Horror. It was 3 a.m. on an early Saturday morning, and I was all alone in the house. I was 17, my parents were out of town, my sister was at a friend's house, I had the joint to myself. It was supposed to be a rare moment of freedom. And this was nothing like the epic 80s teens movies, where, the house is demolished, like Tom Cruise and, Portia in the lake, that type of thing. None of that. Nope, it was just me, some junk food. I got my Doritos, I got my dips, I have all that stuff. And it was just going to be me alone. Now, earlier that night, I had been watching a few horror movies, stuff that gets you in the mood since you have the place to yourself. Halloween and Friday the 13th, that sort of stuff. And then the last portion of the evening was spent adding music tracks to a silent film. Now, this was my latest obsession. I worked at a video store at the time, and I learned how to put sound over existing films. Usually it'd be a matter of copying the film and then just inserting your own sound. And I had recently purchased a VHS version of the classic film Nosferatu. And I was a little bit bummed by the copy. Now, of course, the movie itself is horrifying and iconic visually, but the music they used was kind of boring and bland. It didn't really set the mood right. I think it was like something like some bad organ music. So anyway, on this particular Friday night, I decided I'd gather a bunch of my cassettes, get all my cables and things together, and insert my own music into the movie. You do a scene, and you'd add your own sort of soundtrack to it. And if I recall correctly, it had a lot of early Peter Gabriel, the edgier, darker stuff. Joy Division, Tears for Fears, just appropriately eerie music. Now, the trick to doing this, by the way, is you need to find the right tune that matched not only the mood of the scene, but you'd had to get the beat right too. So, in other words, if there was an abrupt movement, ideally the beat of the song would punctuate that. Or if there was an ocean scene, then something in the song might give the impression of wind or waves. It's kind of tricky business, especially when you're a high schooler who's using sort of a jerry-rig system of cables and chords. But by the end of the evening, what I had, at least what I thought, was a masterpiece. The film was suddenly much creepier, appropriately so. And I'm sure if I were to see that, I have no idea what happened to the videotape, but I'm sure if I saw it this day, it would feel rather dated. But nonetheless, at the time, I was rather pleased with myself. All right, time for bed. So I hit the sack. Here I am in bed, staring at my ceiling, envisioning scenes from what I consider to be one of the most horrifying vampires in movie history. And then all of a sudden, I hear a loud crash. Something from downstairs, something from the kitchen, most likely. For the time being, I froze, and I was listening, and I was listening, and I was listening. Quietly, I grabbed the only thing in my room that seemed to have any value as a weapon, and that was an iron. Now, for some reason, I had been ironing earlier that week, and I happened to have an iron left in my room. But that was what I had. There was my weapon, my iron. Now, it was the early 1980s in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so this time frame, the Golden State Killer was still at large. And so, of course, that's in my head. The vampire's in my head. So I didn't want to do anything rash, so I waited. I huddled in my room, probing the downstairs with my ears, listening for any new sounds, listening. Now, I'd be doing this for pretty much the entire night. Iron clenched in one hand, me laying on my back staring at the ceiling, just trying to figure out if anyone is in the house. So in true cliffhanger style, I'll get back to the story a little bit later. We'll come back to the spine-chilling conclusion a little bit later in this podcast. But first, let me give you a little bit of backstory on the film that I was editing. Nosferatu, a silent film from Germany, very often on the top 10 horror movies of all time. It's a classic. Now, the first time I ever heard about this film, I was about 9 or so, and I'd ordered Edward Edelson's Great Monsters of Movies. And this was then, I don't know if you remember, they had like the Scholastic catalog at school, and you'd order books from. Well, anyway, when the book arrives, I was somewhat disappointed at first. It was smaller than I envisioned. It was a little paperback, but nonetheless, I dove in, and there were plenty of black and white photos, and the cover had a black and white image of King Kong. Now, fortunately, there were enough photos because nobody wants words when you're a kid, right? But there were enough photos to kind of keep me engaged, and the photographs span for basically about 50 years of horror films. Hastily, I flipped through, past the preface, of course, who reads the preface, until I got to the silent film section. And I was stopped in my tracks. And I was stopped because I had just seen the scariest thing I had ever seen. And it was an image of a black and white image of a pale, bald man with pointy little ears and a long claw-like hand leaning over a figure, ominously crouched. So it was kind of like leaning over a woman in a bed. His mouth was open just slightly, but it revealed long, pointy rat teeth. Now, the eeriest part of the photo, at least to me, was that he was staring at the camera, which meant he was staring at me. Now, this was from the film Nosferatu. This was Count Orlok. Now, these days, when you think of a vampire, most folks have this, envision a Hungarian accented aristocrat ensconced with long black capes with sort of a red silk lining. You might imagine someone beautiful yet deadly. Many of you envision Bela Lugosi, who is this hypnotic, sexy vampire. Now, granted, vampires have evolved, so it's not all sexy vampires anymore, because nowadays they can also be sort of hideous villains. But by and large, they are still viewed as the most attractive of all monsters. They are mostly seducers. Their beauty lures you to your doom. And in many ways, they are stand-ins for the devil. The devil tempts you with something desirable, but at its core, it's pure ugliness. It's sort of like, the anglerfish, those deep sea dwellers that have a little tendril growing out of their head with a tiny little phosphorescent lantern at the tip, a pretty little thing, pretty little light to lure fish. And what the little fish don't see is this horrible, long-fanged ugliness that waits to chomp. Now imagine this creature without the pretty little lantern, and pretty much that's what you get with Count Orlok, aka Nosferatu. So in terms of the plot of Nosferatu, it's pretty much Dracula. The names have been changed and characters are altered a little bit or deleted. The ending is quite different, but it's still unmistakably a less than veiled interpretation of Bram Stoker's 1898 Gothic horror novel. Now, the producer of Nosferatu, Albin Grau, figured that the changes that he made would be enough, and he didn't really worry about it. Change a few names, we're good. So the producer was very much into mystical things and the occult. In fact, he was a member of Fraternitas Saturni, which is Brotherhood of Saturn. And this is a magical order. In fact, it's the oldest magical order in Germany. So making a vampire film seemed, kind of right up his alley. But now there's another reason that Albin was compelled to create a vampire film. And this really comes from his service in World War I. He and his comrades, while they were doing, their soldiering, came across a poor Serbian farmer. And over one night during a campfire, over drinks, the farmer proceeded to talk about his father. Not like, oh, my dad's a farmer, not that sort of stuff. No, he started talking about how his dad was one of the undead. His dad was a vampire. Now, of course, no one really knows whether the vampire dad conversation ever really took place. It is quite possible that Grau fed it to the press, just to kind of promote the film. Now, on the other hand, though, that region of Eastern Europe is pretty filled with vampire legends. Just oodles and oodles of them. In fact, just recently, I read something in the news about a grave that was discovered that housed a female vampire. Now, to be clear, this is not necessarily a vampire, but a woman who was suspected of vampirism. This grave was from the 17th century. And the reason they know that it was a potential vampire was because it had a sickle placed over her. But not just like the sickle was lying, over her body, but it was placed in a way so that the blade of the sickle was directly over the corpse's neck. So that if she decided to leave the grave for a yummy taste of blood, she would be decapitated. On this body, they also found a padlock on one of the big toes, which they suspect is more symbolic than utilitarian, trying to keep the corpse down. And I thought this whole sickle thing was a rather inventive way, to sort of keep your vampire down. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And actually, that whole legend about vampire stakes, where you're supposed to pound a stake through a vampire's heart, the idea is essentially the same thing, keeping the corpse down. That tradition was used to essentially nail the corpse into the coffin. You'd pound the stake in and nailing them there, and they can't get out and cause any trouble. Now, in any event, the chat with this farmer that Albin Grau had, as well as the legends of Eastern Europe, that's really what gave him the idea for Nosferatu. And the full title of the film is Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror. Now, you're probably familiar with the word Nosferatu. Pretty much every single vampire movie uses Nosferatu, undead, usually synonymous with the word vampire. Now, interestingly enough, this word is probably a mistranslation. It actually doesn't. It doesn't actually exist in Romanian or really in any Eastern European country. Now, nobody really knows what the word was that Stoker was using, but it could be the Romanian word for unclean, which is necoratu. Could be unbearable, Romanian word for bearable, which is nesuferit, or maybe a Greek word meaning disease-bearing, nosophoros. And regardless of the root, though, the term Nosferatu stuck, and now it is in every film. And if it wasn't a real word in the 1800s, man, it sure is now. A few years back, I had the opportunity to spend time in Slovakia, which, by the way, is where many of the castle scenes in Nosferatu were filmed. My wife, Andrea, has family there, so we went there on a little visit. And on the visit, we stopped by the capital, which is Bratislava. And in there is an area called the Old Town. And this is a remnant of the medieval fortress. And there's a place there called Michael's Gate. And it was sort of the gate that you would enter to come into town. And as legend has it, back in the olden days, back in the medieval days, one very early morning at 4 a.m. to be precise, the witching hour, a knocking came at the gate. And the guard was there. His name apparently was Peter. And he looked out and he saw two men standing there in the shadows, one of which was holding this long, ominous scythe. And the two men wanted in, claiming they wanted shelter from the rain or something like that. Peter said, nope, sorry, it's way too late. Can't come in. Wait till the morning, then I'll let you in. But then a pale hand reached through the opening in the gate, holding a piece of gold, and handed it to Peter. And Peter said, all right, come on in. and the two men entered. The first thing they did was to kill Peter, and then they went on a killing spree, killing people left and right in Bratislava. Now, it is said that these two creepy strangers, were the ones who brought the plague to Bratislava. Now, I bring this up for a few reasons. First off, I love old creepy legends like this. That would be one reason. But the other reason is because Albin Grau envisioned the main vampire of Nosferatu as a plague bringer. Consider that when Nosferatu was conceived, a couple things weighed prominently in the German psyche. First, World War I. I mean, it was over, but there were years of death and destruction. And now the second thing, and in many ways more recent thing, was the Spanish flu. From the years 1918 to 1920, it killed 25 to 50 million people worldwide, and roughly 250,000 people in Germany alone. So what Grau envisioned in his production Nosferatu was the vampire was not just a bringer of a death here and a death there. No. The Count Orlok character is synonymous with doom that touches every corner of life, which really makes this film stand apart from the source material, as well as most subsequent vampire films. Now, to pull off this vision, Grau chose F.W. Murnau to be the director of this. And this was a guy who was known for meticulous detail in his productions. Now, as for the actor who is going to portray this embodiment of doom, Murnau chose Max Schreck. Now, those of you who know German might get a kick out of that because Schreck, no, it doesn't mean green ogre, but it means fright, which seems quite appropriate, and you might even be thinking that it was a stage name that was concocted as a way of promoting the film. And some actually believe that Max Schreck was actually an anonymous actor that was never ever identified, while others believe that the Count Orlok character was actually played by Murnau. And part of the reason they thought that was Murnau was actually a tall guy, as is the character of Count Orlok, and so maybe they thought that it was actually the same person. Now, another less plausible, though quite enticing, theory was that Murnau actually traveled to Slovakia to find a vampire to play the role. Now, of course, I love this idea, but that's probably not true, though they did base a pretty amusing film called Shadow of the Vampire based on this premise, starring John Malkovich as Murnau and Willem Dafoe as Count Orlok. But none of that was true. Max Schreck was indeed a real person, and Schreck was indeed his real last name. He was a bit odd and a bit reclusive, and not much was really known about him, but no, it was in fact a real actor and not a vampire. Shucks. Now, it's not really that surprising that a lot of these stories sort of popped up, because the makeup of the vampire is pretty transformative, and it's really quite nightmarish. Orlok wears this long coat that's almost gravedigger-esque, and his hands are really more like talons. As for Orlok's face, it's bald and pale and skeletal with these big, wild, bulging eyes, pointed ears, and teeth, those horrible, long, pointed teeth. These were not the canine fangs that we're used to seeing in the more romantic vampire films. No. These are more reminiscent of a disease-carrying rat. So, as I said, Slovakia was chosen as sort of the stand-in for Transylvania. And in particular, they filmed at Orava Castle to shoot many of the castle scenes. And I was actually really close to there. I didn't know it. Had I known that, I would have stopped on by. But when I was there, I was so close. Oh well, I found out too late. But anyway, this is a castle that, like many castles, has its own legends, and it's kind of an eerie castle, sort of foreboding structure that's built on a cliff. And the castle itself has this legend of the White Lady who haunts the halls. And the story is she had an abusive husband who chopped off her hand after she sided with a servant that he abused, and then she died of the wound, and now she subsequently haunts the halls. So, perfect setting to film a vampire movie, right? So as I mentioned, the story of Nosferatu is the Dracula story. So if you're not familiar, a young solicitor, in this case named Hutter instead of Harker. So Hutter goes to Transylvania to make a deal with this strange Count, not Dracula, Count Orlok, who wants to purchase a property in Hutter's town. He sees some pretty weird things while in Transylvania, as maybe you would, especially when visiting a vampire count. He sees a werewolf, which was actually a hyena in the filming. But somebody goes, ooh, a werewolf, and it's a hyena. But, he sees this creepy castle, he meets a creepy count, and is bitten at some point by Count Orlok. He does manage to escape, though, but meanwhile, the count is already on the move, heading to Hutter's town. And he does this on boat. He has 6 coffins with him. The entire crew of the boat is murdered. Mysteriously, nobody knows that he's on board inside one of the coffins. And the boat, like a phantom, comes unmanned, seemingly unmanned, to the harbor. Now, along with the coffins that the Count brought were rats, and also the plague. Now the Count moves into his new digs right across the way from Hutter's fiancée, Ellen, Mina in the novel Dracula. And every night, Count Orlok creepily watches her through his window. Now the city is overrun with plague, and it's sort of unclear, and I think intentionally so, it's unclear whether these plague victims are actual vampire victims, or if they're actually literally from the rats and the plague. I do think it's intentionally nebulous. Now, the best parts of the film are not necessarily associated with the plot. It's actually Murnau's iconic scenes, these haunting images that he uses in creating this film. There's a great scene where Hutter is in Castle Orlok discussing business with the Count, at this point, the Count is wearing a weird little regal cap which disguises his rat ears, and Hutter reluctantly dines, perhaps being a little bit put off by Orlok's weird demeanor and looks. But suddenly, a small little clock with a skeleton holding a scythe starts chiming, which startles Hutter, and this startles him as he's slicing a piece of bread, which he subsequently cuts his thumb. Orlok jumps up, exclaiming, "Your precious blood!" and he approaches him with a mad look. The vampire grabs the wounded hand and pulls it to his mouth to drink. The shocked Hutter pulls away. Now, this is a classic scene that's used over and over and over again in various films, though it's not actually in the novel. Now, there is a fun bit of trivia in another castle scene in which the Count studies these documents relating to his potential real estate purchase. Now, if you look closely at the documents, it's not words, it's not letters that he's looking at. It's rather these strange symbols. These are mystical symbols, and these are courtesy of the occultist producer, Albin Grau. So, by the way, this is a scene in which a picture of Hutter's fiancée, Ellen, falls out of his pack. And the Count grabs it and he greedily holds it close to inspect in sort of a creepy stalker way. And to make things even creepier, he says, "Ooh, she has a lovely neck." And that's pretty creepy when you think that he's moving in right next door. Now, a few scenes later, Murnau really goes to town with the creep factor. Here, he has Hutter in his room, and something is heard outside his bedroom. And when he goes to open the door, he sees a very chilling image. Standing across the hall, way down the hall, framed by shadows, is Count Orlok, standing motionless. And it's super freaky, because it gives the impression that Orlok has been there for hours, motionless, just waiting, frozen, waiting for the right moment. And it's this scene where Murnau really starts using the shadows of the Count for impact. At one point, Hutter is petrified beneath his covers, and you see this shadow of the vampire's bald head with pointed ears and claws moving up across the sheets. It's really quite horrifying. Now, I think one of the major differences in Nosferatu versus Dracula is that Ellen/Mina is actually the hero of the tale. She, and she alone, defeats the vampire. So in the storyline, Hutter had managed to find his way back home. He'd been bitten, but he'd managed to find his way back home. And Ellen, while he's away, one day, she is rummaging through his bag and finds this book on vampirism. Now, this is a book that he found in one of the villages outside of the Count's castle. But she's reading through it, and Hutter is away, doing whatever Hutter is doing. And she reads that the only way to defeat this evil is for a pure woman to sacrifice herself to the beast. She must sacrifice her blood and keep the vampire with her until after the sun rises. Okay, so meanwhile, outside, after reading this, she sees a procession of coffins moving down the street. And just as a quick note, I remember watching this film during the COVID lockdown time frame. It was one of the films I just happened to put on. I was watching it. And this was, of course, I don't know, I'm sure you remember, it was a very weird time. It was very claustrophobic. It was very unsettling. And suddenly, the symbolism of the vampire as plague really kind of set in. It's the idea that no one is safe. Lock your doors, close your windows, but darkness is still out there waiting. There's only so much you can do. Now, this all leads to what I think is the most amazing scene in all of cinema. This is the part where Ellen sacrifices herself. Now, not telling her fiancé her plans, she sends him away, and he goes off, and then she goes to her window. And there, of course, across the way is Count Orlok, staring at her, creepily, like before, almost like he'd been waiting there motionless for hours, just waiting for her. Now, she flings the windows wide open, and the vampire, of course, takes the cue and makes his way towards her. Now for the good part, the stairway scene. Now, I have no doubt that you have seen this somewhere, even just a clip of it. What you see is a flight of stairs, and then a stark wall along the flight of stairs. And then you see the shadow of Orlok and his claws, just his shadow, moving up the stairs. Not him, just the shadow. The shadow then reaches to open the door. Now, meanwhile, Ellen is in her nightgown, lying in bed. Then, what you see is the shadow of the vampire's hand moving across her chest, and then when it reaches the area of her heart, it squeezes. You see her reeling in pain as if the shadow is clutching onto her actual heart. The vampire is then seen hunched over her, drinking her blood. And this is the scene that I saw in that book when I was a kid. That scene of him leaning over her. And then all of a sudden, the rooster crows. He looks up, wide-eyed, and it crows again. Now, holding his heart, he rushes away, but is stopped by the sunlight shining through the window, in which case he dissolves into smoke. Now, Ellen, in a brief moment of triumph, sort of swoons as Hutter rushes in, but it's too late. She then dies in his arms. But the vampire is dead. Now, I want you to think of all the times you've seen vampire movies in which the vampire is killed or injured by sunlight. Lots, right? Well, this is actually the first time sunlight was considered a method of killing a vampire. The novel Dracula says that a vampire is weaker during daylight, but it's not like having acid on flesh. And it's funny to think how common that idea is now. It's sort of a given. Okay, so the film is finished. The premiere is held at what is the Marble Room at the Berlin Zoological Gardens, where the attendees were told to dress in sort of a late 1800s garb. But, Bram Stoker's widow, who was in charge of the estate at this point, finds out about the film and takes Alvin Grau to court. The court eventually decides that all of the copies must be destroyed. And the only reason that you're able to see this film today is that some of those copies had already been shipped to other countries and the US, and copies were made of that. But it was so close where you might have never ever known this film ever existed. And that, to me, would have been like a horrible, horrible tragedy. Okay, now, I put you in suspense long enough. Back to the opening story, where I was frozen in terror. Here I was, locked in my room, frozen in terror, like Ellen, waiting, listening for sounds of a potential intruder. So I'm listening, nothing. I hear nothing. At this point, I walk to the hallway. Now, it's a long walk down the hallway. And then there's the corner. And on the corner, you turn the corner and there's the stairwell. So I walked all the way up to the corner. But all I could think about at this point was Orlok's shadow moving up the stairs. And then I started thinking about the potential of someone right on the other side of the corner, right around the corner from me, waiting to pounce once I made one more step. Now, I was in horror movie mode, and so then the next thing I thought of, horror movie, what would typically happen is you get there and you expect something around the corner, and then they sneak up behind you, right? So I decided it was time to retreat. So I retreated back to my bedroom, locked the door, and I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat listening. I didn't hear anything, but I kept listening. Maybe I'd hear some little thing, but it could have easily been the refrigerator or something like that. I stayed up all night until the sun was up. And it's kind of funny how that radiating orb kind of gives this sense of safety. So I walked out cautiously, surveying the house, looking in the downstairs, nothing out of ordinary. But wait! I noticed the grocery bags full of snacks that I hadn't unpacked had tipped over. And on the ground was a Cheetos bag. Okay, so, all right, that explains it. The contents of the bag overnight had shifted. Gravity had moved things and it tipped over. All my paranoia was for nothing. But then I examined the Cheeto bag on the ground. And what I found about an inch apart were 2 puncture wounds. Nah, just kidding. There weren't any puncture wounds. But I will say this. When I went to 7-Eleven, I did not pick up Crunchy Cheetos. I would never pick up Crunchy Cheetos. Crunchy Cheetos are wrong. I would have picked up, and I did pick up, Cheeto Puffs. But these were Crunchy Cheetos. So I don't know. Maybe there was an intruder who liked Crunchy Cheetos. Sounds like a good idea for a horror movie. That's it for this week's episode, everybody. Thanks for listening. Be sure to pop in again. There's going to be new tales of myth and magic popping up in the future. So tell your friends. That's always helpful. And if you're interested, stop by my website, www.michaeldeming.com, and you can see some of the artwork that I create that might relate to what we're talking about. And if you want to delve a little further into the topic, I'll have blog posts that relate to each of these podcasts. So until we meet again, I'll be mything you.